All done. All silent. Going. Gone. So congratulations.
Welcome to the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate. Each episode, we chat with real estate author and industry leader Peter O'Malley to discuss the current property market conditions and provide insights to assist you on your property journey.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Current Market Insights. I'm your host, Kieran O'Brien, and with me, as always, is my good friend, Mr. Peter O'Malley. Peter, hello.
Kieran, how are you?
I'm doing well, Peter. Yourself?
Yeah, really well, thanks.
Good to hear. Back for another week on the podcast here, Peter. We've had some pretty interesting topics over the last couple of months, and I thought we might continue on today with an area of special interest, I guess. You, as always, you're a prolific writer. And you're an expert, I think, in the property space. And you've written a really great article in your monthly newsletter this month talking about vested interests or, identifying conflicts of interest in real estate. So I thought we might spend the large portion of today's episode just going over this article, having a bit of a look at what some of the common vested interests are or some of the common conflicts. And if we can, give our listeners some insights into how they might best navigate those in their transactions.
That's right. Conflict of interest is an interesting one, Kieran, because it exists in so many facets of the real estate industry, whether it be buying, selling, leasing, strata management. And just because a potential conflict of interest exists, it doesn't mean that the parties involved are swayed by that conflict of interest, but it needs to be identified so everything can be assessed in totality by the person on the other side of the negotiation.
Okay, so what you're sort of saying is that there are obviously a whole range of areas where the conflict can occur, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's more just about identifying that they do exist and being aware of your obligations or possible, I guess, duties in regards to some of those.
As a real estate agent, yes, but for consumers who the article's written for, it's really helpful for them to be able to identify conflict of interests in real time so they can call those conflict of interests out or at the very least be aware of them in their discussions with the counterparty, whether that's a real estate agent they're trying to buy from, a real estate agent they're trying to sell through, the buyer they might be negotiating with, for example.
Okay, so why don't we have a look in a little bit more depth, I guess, at some of these particular topics. So the first one you mentioned in your article is that the buyer themselves has another property to sell in the agent's local area. Now, to me, that seems like a fairly obvious conflict of interest, and the buyers would be aware of that, I would think. They would certainly know that they have a property to sell. So what's your take on this conflict? Is this something that a buyer should identify to an agent, do you think, or is it something they should hold on to, that bit of information?
Well, look, what we say here is that the buyer has another property to sell locally. An agent's fiduciary duty lies with the person paying them, their existing vendor. However, a potential buyer may say to the agent something to the effect, hey, if you can help us get this one, you can have ours to sell. So suddenly the agent is laying out an inducement for the agent to assist them, subtly, of course, but assist them in getting the sale across the line. And when listings are tight, as they are in the inner west at the moment, professional agents will be able to stare that conflict of interest down, and some agents may be swayed by it. As a vendor, you need to be aware that if it's a local buyer buying your property and they have something to sell, you need to be completely comfortable that your agent is able to divorce themselves from those conflicts of interest.
So in your experience in the inner west over 20 odd years of real estate, do you think that this is a common conflict that you see on the ground? And if so, do you think most agents are swayed by that inducement?
Look, I'm not here to rubbish any individuals and say this person's conflicted or they're not. This is a very subtle one. This is very nuanced. A lot of the points that we'll discuss here, Kieran, are very subtle and nuanced. And to be frank, you'll never quite know about every conflict of interest, and you are very reliant on trusting the person that you employ to sell your property. So lots of crucial conversations happen about the sale of your property that you're not involved in as the vendor, and you're completely trusting of the person representing you. And that's why I always encourage people, don't choose a real estate agent because they quote a high price to you. Don't choose a real estate agent because they quote a low commission to you, because when the crucial conversations happen, the one that will determine what the net proceeds are for you, you won't be in the room, and you're fully reliant on the skill level, the professionalism and the integrity of your real estate agent.
Yeah, you always mention two particular pearls that stick with me, Peter, which is the best time to negotiate with your agent is before you sign the agreement, and that the agent is the person that you hire, you're hiring to negotiate and represent your house when you're not there. And I think it's really important that you outline that taking that time before the campaign starts is the best way to ensure you get the best agent.
And that's right. When you are interviewing agents and hiring agents, an agent who gives you everything that you could conceivably want may not necessarily be the right agent to handle the sale for you, because they're essentially a lackey who have a checklist of things that they're ticking off from you just to meet your criteria. But at the end of the day, can they handle themselves in a fairly robust negotiation, as some of them can be? Will they be swayed by a buyer saying, hey, if you can help us get this one, you can have ours to sell?
Yeah, certainly important to get the agent with integrity.
Can I say to agents, and again, I'm not here to disparage any particular agents, but the buyer will respect you a whole lot more if you do the right thing by your vendor and get the best possible price than if you show any favouritism towards them during the negotiation.
Yeah, well, I can see how it makes sense that the buyers may be interviewing you to a certain extent as well as the agent, if they're offering that to see what kind of character you have and whether or not you will be swayed by that kind of adjustment. Yeah. Look, moving on, you mentioned that another area of conflict is related to developers. We see some of it in the inner west, probably not as much these days, but there's certainly developer sales around, and you suggest that the developer may promise the agent to get the resale.
Yeah, well, look, we're using the term developer here very loosely. A flipper, a renovator, even a builder who buys a home to live in and says, I'm going to fix this up over the next few years. Anyone that goes into a real estate transaction with an intention of improving the value of the property and then selling at the other end for a gain is essentially a developer in this example. And developers and flippers usually lead with the line to real estate agents, if you can find us something, we'll give it back to you when we're ready to sell it. And that's great and that's well-meaning, but the real estate agent in 98% of transactions is being paid by the vendor, but they've already been saddled. They may not have asked for that promise, but they've already been saddled with an obligation from the purchaser that if I buy through you, I'll sell through you, therefore you should help me.
Yeah, of course. I can certainly attest that I've had this offer before when showing properties. Do you think, in your experience, that it's a particularly common line around the inner west? Because there are a lot of DIY
it's
developers.
A really common line from developers using the definition we just described. What I would say is that some developers stick to the promise and give you the listing back, and some don't. But to say that I do the right thing personally by my vendors is I just disregard that every time, and I just say to the people straight that that won't form part of the thinking in how we run this campaign. It'll be run as a full and proper campaign in its own right, and if you're the best buyer at the other end, I'd love to give you some advice about how to maximise the price as you choose to exit the property.
Yeah, really sound advice, Peter. Moving on then, you talk about strata managers. This is obviously a topic we touched on only a few weeks ago when talking about the net strata situation. But take us through the conflicts that exist in strata, and I would imagine some are along the lines of what we have talked about before.
Oh, yeah, we did cover this one in depth, but unfortunately for the people that were customers of that strata firm, they were paying inflated commissions for the strata manager to tip them into an insurance policy that was run by an insurance company that was owned by the strata manager. And there was non-disclosure there, and the brokerage fees for sourcing that policy was, that they stand accused of taking brokerage fees 3 times the industry average. So that was a massive conflict of interest and breach of faith. And if those accusations are proven correct, that strata firm will wear a pretty heavy penalty, I imagine. The reason that we've highlighted that there is that even if the allegations are proven incorrect, what the whole process demonstrates is conflict of interest exists everywhere, and the conflict of interest was not disclosed in financial records, and it took the investigative powers of a journalist who was probably tipped off by someone to dig deep on this and shine a light in a dark corner.
Yeah, I think from memory in the article, it was actually an insider from the management firm that stepped out and gave away the crux of the article. You do highlight a big issue, though, that engaging with strata firms can be quite complex. And I think engaging with anyone to manage your property, whether it be a property manager at a sort of local level or a strata managing agency at a much larger scale, it does create obviously a whole range of conflicts, but also a whole range of issues that you as an independent investor within that complex may have no ability to navigate. So I wonder, you may not know the answer to this, but in your experience, are there any good tips, or can you give any advice to any potential listeners out there who are investing, who have issues with the strata manager, how they might best go about finding out how to find a good one, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
Oh, look, strata managers is probably the weakest section of the real estate industry at the moment. If I see one consistent complaint from consumers, aside from underquoting to home buyers, the most prevalent next complaint is the standard of strata managers. I don't know why the strata manager space is so difficult. I've never done it, never will do it, but it is a real source of frustration for the consumer out there. Are the fees too low? So they need to do what this firm is standing accused of having to top up the income by duplicit means, or is it just an uninspired segment of the real estate industry? I don't really know. But you've got to interview people and ask hard questions before you sign. As you just said there about employing a selling agent to sell your property, have the tough conversation up front. You've got to have the tough conversation up front with a strata manager to hold them to account. I think there's something there in the legislation. They need to be continually reappointed by the owners committee.
Yeah, correct.
So every time they're up for reappointment, there needs to be tough questions asked. And they're not tough questions that you think of on the night. These need to be documented and things really chased through so that you can hold them to account at the point that you need to. I spoke to a consumer who wanted to change strata managers because he felt that the whole insurance issue and the commission being charged as a percentage of the insurance policy was not fair, given that the policies had tripled in fees. Therefore, the brokerage fee that was being claimed by the strata manager was also going to go up exponentially. And then when he went and interviewed another strata manager, the new strata manager who wanted the business said, we're just going to do exactly the same as them, but we're not going to hide from it, because that's essentially how we make our money or our margin in this environment. So no, I won't agree to be charging a lower commission on those policies. Now, the consumer said these people are acting like a cartel. If that's the case, regulators would step in or will step in the future and address that. But margins are tight everywhere at the moment, so business does need a lick of the ice cream to keep them in the game. And if that's a bigger commission on insurance policies and that's what they're surviving on, so be it. That's completely different to what the strata firm did, who were accused in the media. They were doing everything to taking kickbacks from tradespeople, and they were paid by the owners committee to source the best tradespeople, but then they were getting kickbacks from the tradespeople. So they were double dipping essentially. That's clearly a conflict of interest there.
Yeah, I think you've outlined it really, really well. And I think it's also important to point out to our listeners that it is possible for buildings to manage themselves as well. You know, if the committee can organise well, they don't actually need a strata manager. They can look after affairs. And anecdotally too, Peter, I don't think I have ever spoken to anyone in real estate who has said that they would love to go and be a strata manager either. So you're certainly not alone in that position. Moving on then, I guess coming down the investment chain a little bit to more local, you talk about property managers and some of the conflicts that they come across. And I think some of these would be fairly obvious, but perhaps some may be a little more nuanced for our listeners.
Yeah, look, the first example there is a property managers are constantly having to work through these conflicts. And I think the most common that property managers face is the multi-property landlord who doesn't wish to fulfil their obligations and maintain their properties adequately. And we call those landlords slumlords, where it's just give me the rent, but don't tell me what my obligations are. to the property manager, and if you do tell me what my obligations are and you do expect me to reinvest continually in these properties, I'll fire you and go to a different firm that doesn't give me such grief. And when the rental market is as tight as it is at the moment, cost of living is where it is at the moment, and interest rates are elevated, landlords are not looking for areas to spend additional money at the moment. I'm not suggesting that landlords who have a slumlord mentality are common in the property market at the moment, but they do exist. And if you get someone who's entering in the real estate industry, they're below, say, 25 years of age, and they're dealing with a very seasoned, very hardened property professional who's got a substantial portfolio who underinvests in their property, it's just easier for the rental agent to push that pressure back onto the tenants and say the landlord doesn't want to do it, doesn't want to fulfill their obligations, and if you don't like it, you can leave. So without wanting to, the poor young property manager is sort of sandwiched or conflicted, if you like, about holding their client to account because they don't want to lose the portfolio. And the next thing their boss will say, why did Mr. Jones, who's got 10 properties with our firm and has had 10 rental properties with our firm for the last 20 years, why has he just taken them back? And the property manager says, because I made him fix the bathroom or the toilet. That's not a conversation that the young property manager wants to have with their boss. So they're the knock-on effects, if you like, of the dynamics that can take place in a real estate agency.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you talk about that, and we certainly, we know from experience that a lot of junior property managers are the ones that have to have these conversations, and they're new to the industry, as you're saying. They don't have maybe the nous or the ability to stand up and talk through those challenging scenarios. I'm interested to get from you though, Peter. Obviously you own an office. Would you rather have the landlord that under invests in his property but has a larger portfolio, or spends up and looks after it but gives himself but also the agency a good name and a much easier portfolio?
Oh, look, the answer to your question there is fairly straightforward. But the reality is when you've got a major client that is being ill-disciplined like that, you've got to hold them to account and stand up to them. And the best way to do that is remind them of their obligations, let them know what the penalties are if they fall foul of their obligations, and say to the landlord, it's not me verbally going back to the tenant and giving them these instructions. These are your instructions. Please confirm in writing that your instructions to me conflict with the Tenancy Act, and I'll go back to the tenant and tell them if the tenant goes to tribunal and you lose, you own the outcome. Is that how you want me to do it, Mr. Landlord? And then if the landlord says, that's how I want you to do it, full obligation for this rests with the landlord. When we find, and if we find a landlord doesn't want to meet their obligations, whether they're a multi-owner or a single-owner property, and we highlight to them that, hey, you're out of line here, I'm putting it in writing to you that you're out of line, and if this goes wrong and we end up at the tribunal and the tribunal member throws the book at you, you own the outcome, not us. Are you okay with that? And most landlords then will fall into line and say, well, no, I don't want to be going to the tribunal and having a tenant hold me to account.
I think the industry could do with certainly more people like yourself, Peter.
Well, again, it's a little bit like the situation, sorry to cut in, it's a little bit like the situation where the buyer says to the real estate agent, if you help me get this one, you can have mine too. And if you go down that rabbit hole, you actually lose the buyer's respect, because if they lie to me, they'll lie for me, all of that. And It's the same thing again with the landlord. If you let them get away with the practice of not meeting their obligations, but have you as the real estate agent wear the risk, a servant-master scenario forms in the relationship where the landlord appreciates that you're protecting yourself as the agent and them as the landlord by making sure that you're above board, above the line at all times.
Yeah, really good point, Peter. Also on the topic of property managers, you mentioned in the article that another area of possible conflict is in rental references. Now, this is not one that I'd thought of personally, but I'm interested what you think the conflict is. So are you talking about where a property manager may be looking to give a positive reference for a tenant to leave one of their properties? Is that the example you give?
That's right. So you've got a difficult tenant in place. You want them and you hope that they leave. One day, a real estate agent from another firm rings and says, hey, Kieran O'Brien, for example, wants to rent a property through our agency. How do you find him? And it's like, great, if Kieran gets this property, he's off my hands.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Bang, there's the conflict of interest there. Now, I'm not saying this happens, but rest assured, I'm not saying this happens in a widespread manner, but it does happen to some degree.
Yeah. Oh, I think anyone out there could probably recognise it happens in the workspace as well. You know, I'm sure there are plenty of people giving references to offload a challenging employee and not have to worry about the consequences down the line.
Yeah, Charles Tarby, one of my friends who works in the real estate space, says anytime I want a staff member to leave, I praise them publicly because then my competitors ring them up and poach them.
That's a good idea. I got to stop writing positive things about you online, Peter. As we move towards a close on this interesting topic, Peter, the next group you talk about is building inspectors. I'm really interested to get your sense of where the conflict lies in this space, because I think in the Inner West in particular, we've moved into a time where many, many vendors are preloading campaigns with building inspection reports, which to me seems like a good idea. As someone who's missed out a property at auction, I love the idea of not having to just purchase and purchase and purchase with no hope. So to me, it seems like a good thing. Tell us a little bit about where the possible conflict lies in this space, though.
So the real estate agent is the one who is constantly the conduit between the vendor of the day and commissioning the work with the building inspector. So the building inspector is receiving a good percentage of their work from one point. That's the real estate agent or the real estate agency. So it's like, well, any 50-50 issues, I've got to give the vendor the benefit of the doubt, because if I don't give the benefit of the doubt and I write the report the other way, maybe Kieran won't continue to feed me work. Now, again, not saying this is widespread, but you can see where a real estate agent is farming out continual work for the purposes of a report being written, that potentially lies there. In saying that, I do like the new system for this reason, that back in the day and age where the buyer would commission their own report, there were certain firms around Sydney that took it as a badge of honour to absolutely write scathing reports on Victorian homes and had the buyer thinking it was going to blow over in the next wind. And I saw some ridiculous statements and reports written over the years because the building inspector was getting paid whether the buyer bought it or they didn't, and they just absolutely went to town on destroying the credibility of that property. And some of those firms don't exist anymore because when the model flipped to the vendor getting the report prepared pre-going on the market for the availability of the purchaser, real estate agents remembered who rubbished their properties and who wrote fair reports. If you do have concerns as a purchaser about the integrity of a report, or it's not clear in certain areas, do ring the building inspector and talk it through with them, and do find out if there's an open-ended loophole that the building inspector is not on the hook, or is there indemnity insurance covering you should you go on to purchase the subject property and the report inadvertently misses something.
Yeah, look, I'm glad you mentioned insurance because I was going to bring that up. I think it's important for a lot of our listeners to understand that some reports come with inherently sort of grandfathered insurance as part of the report, but many other agencies or companies that we have dealt with, certainly in this area, require the successful buyer to pay an extra fee to actually transfer that insurance over.
And you should always take that, pay
Absolutely.
that extra fee for the buyer.
Yeah, look, I think it's only 40 or 60, it's an inconsequential amount when you look at the value of the home. I think it's been a really interesting topic, this one, Peter. My whole take on this is that as an industry, if we focus on upskilling agents and property managers and strata managers and all the kind of ancillary people that work in the industry, if we upskill them and we recruit with integrity, I feel like we can eliminate a whole bunch of these issues. Most of what we talk about, it's fairly common sense for people like you and I who are, I think we're morally very sound. So we operate with integrity. But to me, these are all conflicts that are easily avoidable if you hire the right person to do the job for you as a seller, someone who is honest and operates with integrity. But as an industry, we also focus on upskilling our people to make sure that they understand when they're potentially being played and they have the trust in their ability and their team to stand up for what is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think when conflict of interest is pointed out to you in black and white terms, it's kind of like, smelling salts under the nose. It's like, oh yeah, of course, you come to your senses. But it can happen so subtly, and it's like moss. It grows on you so subtly you don't notice it happening. And that's the problem with any sort of graft, conflict of interest, corruption, is that it doesn't start out as rampant issues like where the strata manager scenario is at the moment. They stand accused of 3 or 4 major breaches, but it probably happened one at a time. They probably didn't set out. If they are indeed found guilty, they probably had no intentions to set out and become what they've become. They've morphed into that over time.
Yeah, of course. And I think you mentioned earlier with the landlords is a great example of where you've got really seasoned professionals in an industry can slowly manipulate the conversation in their favour over time and through building trust over 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 transactions until they get that leverage.
And they don't know the degree to which they're stepping over the line until someone really holds them to account in regards to that point. They're maybe type A personalities and they're just negotiators at heart, and they think they're negotiating with the young property manager in that instance, for example, Kieran, and they're not negotiating with the young property manager. They're actually lording it over them because the young property manager's got all this fear running through their body. Don't lose any landlords, whatever you do, keep the landlord happy, which means throw the tenant under the bus. Throwing the tenant under the bus will usually land you back at tribunal, and everyone will be standing around on the day at tribunal saying, this is completely avoidable. How did we get here? And it came back to a type A personality, robust landlord who's just used to getting their way because that's how they operate Monday to Friday. And for them, they thought they were in a negotiation when they weren't.
Yeah, really, really great discussion, Peter. Let's wrap up on this point then. In every one of these conflicts, for someone to get the upper hand, there has to be a loser. And I think that's an important takeaway. As we move to close tonight then, let's get our weekly market wrap underway. If you can, run us through the numbers for the week.
So the auction clearance rate was 51% for the week just ended, June 2, 2024. What's interesting, and these are on SQM's researchers' numbers as usual, for the same weekend last year, the auction clearance rate was 61%.
Wow.
Now, what we're seeing something really interesting happening with listings at the moment, Kieran. We're seeing statistically listings across Sydney going up. So last weekend, the total number of scheduled auctions was 1,197, where the weekend, the corresponding weekend last year, there were 893 auctions scheduled. So a sharp jump in the number of listings, but in the inner city as you drive around, you're not really seeing that. So I think the jump in listings is more attributable to what's going on in the suburbs and may well and truly speak to, some mortgage pressure coming through at these interest rates being sustained at a high level and the possibility now that there could be another rate hike in this cycle. So yes, there's definitely no excess listings on market in the inner city, quite the opposite. But there's lots of listings popping up somewhere because the numbers are substantially higher than what they were for the same period last year, and that in turn has seen the auction clearance rate drop weekend on week, year on year for this weekend just gone from 61% to 51%. Slightly softer than the auction clearance rate last week, which was 53.5%, 54%, down to 51%. So that's been interesting. The other big takeaway is there was a lot more property sold at auction under the hammer than there were sold prior for the weekend gone.
So I can't remember exactly, but I think there was 940 odd properties went to auction last week and up to 1,100 this week. So as you say, that is a pretty sizable shift. And that would explain some of the softness in the clearance rate with that excess stock coming on, as you say. Do you think that any number of those could be potential relists that failed slightly earlier in the year?
No, I can't. Well, not in the inner city, not in the markets that we operate in. I can't speak for, more broadly. I guess there's there's an element of that. But what I see with most properties that pass in at auction, they quickly withdraw or they quickly sell.
Yep.
So what happens is on the auction day, the vendor's not quite ready to accept market reality or wants to push the price up a little bit more, a bit of all of that, or there is no market for their property near the price they want for it, and they just throw the towel in the week or two after the auction, if not the day after.
Yeah, certainly really interesting numbers, Peter, and I think the increase in listings is particularly surprising given we've just come into winter and it is usually a softer time for real estate. I think with the possibility of a rate rise ahead, there are certainly some more tough times to come in the property sector.
Yeah, look, maybe not. In the inner city, prices and sales, particularly of houses, are ticking over fine. So, look, a rate hike is unwelcome at any time, but the reason we may get a rate hike is because, across the board, the economy seems to be handling it, and therefore inflation's pushing up. The rest of the world's inflation rate is fairly disinflationary, and Australia has now got the world's most aggressive inflation in the last couple of months. So something's going right domestically to the degree that the RBA may need to hose it down a little bit more with another rate hike.
Yeah, certainly. I know no one's looking forward to it, but a possibility, that's for sure. Look, Peter, really great chat today. I want to thank you as always for coming in and talking with us on the podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks, Kieran.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to everyone for listening to Current Market Insights. We look forward to speaking with you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate, the podcast providing real estate insights you won't find anywhere else.